States' massive retaliation strikes. It took a decade for the mad policy of mutually assured destruction to prevail. But throughout the 1960s, the US and NATO deployed so-called tactical theater nuclear weapons, many with the destructive capability of the Hiroshima A-bomb, as well as strategic hydrogen nuclear weapons at sea, more powerful than up to 50 times more powerful than the Nagasaki A-bomb. By the mid-1960s, with more than 7,000 US nuclear weapons in Europe, Europeans rightly feared that they would suffer the most in a nuclear war. It was widely understood that a so-called limited war could easily escalate to a total nuclear war. And as Daniel Ellsberg learned, the US single integrated operational plan, which is to say launching all of the missiles, anticipated the deaths of more than 500 million people across Eurasia. This was US and NATO doctrine, the murder of more than 500 million people. Then as now, the challenge for US strategists was to prevent Europe's decoupling from the United States, the Western foothold on Eurasia. To prevent Europe from going its own way, the Nuclear Planning Group was created, as were dual-key launch controls. Throughout this period, the US-NATO nuclear arsenal had objectives other than containment. As President Carter's Secretary of War, Harold Brown, testified, with nuclear weapons as the core of US security systems, US conventional forces became, and I quote, meaningful instruments of military and political power. As Noam Chomsky explained, this meant that we have succeeded in sufficiently intimidating anyone who might help protect those we are determined to attack. Thus, as early as 1946, before the Soviet Union broke the US nuclear monopoly, President Truman threatened Moscow with nuclear annihilation in order to reinforce US dominance in Iran. US nuclear weapons in Europe were essential to US preparations for and threats to initiate nuclear war, not only during the Berlin crises of 1948 and 1961, but as the US reinforced its hegemony of the oil-rich Middle East, which was long the geostrategic center of the struggle for world power. As I've outlined in my book, which is outside Empire and the Bomb, such threats were also made during the Suez Crisis in 1956, the incursion into Lebanon and the revolution in Iraq in 1958, the 1962 missile crisis, in which the US threatened all of human existence in order to enforce the principle that the US could deploy nuclear weapons along the Soviet Union's periphery, especially Turkey, but that the Soviet Union could not do likewise. We made these threats and preparations during the Six-Day Middle East War in 1967, the Iraq Wars of 1991 and 2003, and the current all options are on the table threats against Iran. Please understand, Nagasaki was not the last time that the US used nuclear weapons. It's used those weapons repeatedly, just as an armed robber uses a gun when he points it at someone's head, whether or not the trigger is pulled.
Dear friends and colleagues, on behalf of the Hamasadi Party in Europe, I'm deeply touched and honored to be invited to such a gathering to give rise to the suffering people of Afghanistan and share a small part of the grief that millions of Afghans suffer. Afghanistan has only known wars, military invasions, destruction, destitution, misery over the past 3 decades. Today it is once again a battlefield among powers vying for influence in the heart of Asia. The game masters have continued to create victims, oppressors, victors, terrorists, peace-loving dictators, and masters, each group changing rules as the rule of the game changes. Over the past 3 decades, neither the creators nor the created have changed, but just the rules we play. The same characters were once allies, freedom fighters, democratic-minded, and moderates. With the time, the same characters are enemies, terrorists, fanatics, and downright monstrous. Such changes in the rules of the game in the Afghan amphitheater have cost hundreds and thousands of lives, dignity, and basic human rights. Let's not forget the disastrous adventurism of the Soviet leadership in late 1970s, which killed directly and through its installed puppet regime nearly 2 million people and permanently maimed another 2 to 4 million people out of an estimated population of about 18 million at the time. The Soviet invasion in a more than a decade-long occupation was the source of miseries in subsequent years. In the past 9 years, the occupation forces led by the US make fool of the world by asserting that they are there to bring peace, democracy, and freedom to Afghan people. But, in fact, it is nothing other than a cynical excuse for strategic, economic, and military interests, once again at the expense of ordinary Afghans. The US and NATO claim that they are fighting terrorism, but in fact, they themselves are terrorizing our people through their bombings and use of dangerous weapons. Most of the people they fight today are their own creation and once hailed as the best allies the US can have. The installed puppet regime is nothing other than a junior lieutenant whose only job is to follow certain minor instructions. The regime's allies, friends, and foes are already defined, and there's little room for dissent from the game master's official line. Today, the best friends of the US and NATO in Afghanistan are warlords and drug lords like Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Karim Khalili, Qasim Fahim, Dr. Abdullah Burhanuddin Rabbani, Muhammad Muhakkik, Atta Muhammad, and many other such murderers and dark-minded individuals and groups who have a long history of human rights violations and atrocities against defenseless people of Afghanistan. There are claims of positive changes in Afghanistan since the US and NATO invasion. Let's just a few. One,